There are places in this country where the rain doesn't fall, it settles. It moves in like a quiet guest and stays until the ground can't hold any more, and everything underneath starts pushing to the surface. Old fears, old stubbornness. The things we bury because we don't know what else to do with them. This is a story about a small town in the Arizona Territory, the spring of 1887. About a lumberjack who kept to himself, a healer nobody wanted, and a handful of children burning with fever. It begins, as most true things do, in the mud. The bone-handled knife on the nail wasn't his. Caleb Hayes walked past it every morning without looking. It hung at eye level beside the cabin door, too small for his hand. The blade folded shut, the bone worn smooth by fingers that were not his own. He poured black coffee into a tin cup and stood at the window. Outside, the rain came down in gray sheets through the ponderosa pines. 6 days now, the Gila had swallowed its own banks and was reaching for the road. Mud, the color of dried blood, crept up from the flats, and the air tasted like iron and wet sage. He had one chair, one cup, one shelf with nothing on it but a liniment bottle and dust. The mule, Boone, brayed from behind the cabin, somewhere downriver. The current pulled something heavy into the dark water, and the sound it made was almost human. If you've ever sat on a porch and watched the rain come down like it had nowhere else to be, I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. Drop your town below. Every small place has a story the world hasn't heard yet. He heard it below the rain, thin, sharp, swallowed almost before it reached him. Could have been a bird. Could have been the river bending a cottonwood past its limit. He stopped. Boone stopped. The mule's ear swiveled forward and locked. It came again, not a bird. Caleb dropped the lead rope and ran. The mudflat near the river bend had gone soft with 6 days of rain. The ground looked solid from the road, reddish, flat, crusted at the edges, but the middle had turned to something alive. It pulled. It swallowed. She was in it to the ribs, a woman. Dark hair plastered to her forehead, hands flat on the surface, fingers spread wide, trying to distribute weight the way someone does who understands mud. A broken branch lay a foot from her reach. She'd stopped screaming. Her breathing was shallow. Counted. Deliberate, 3 in. Hold. 3 out. The breathing of someone who knew that panic would take her under faster than the ground would. A spotted horse stood at the tree line, trembling, reins dragging. It had pulled itself free. She hadn't. Caleb hit the mud at a run and sank to his thighs in 2 steps. Cold, far colder than the air. Cold enough to lock the muscles in his legs. His left boot stayed behind. He kept going. His right boot went next. He reached for her wrist and missed, his foot sliding sideways, and he went down on one knee. Mud slapped against his chest. The cold drove the air out of him. He grabbed again. Got her. Small bones, tight skin, tendons hard as braided wire. She gripped back strong, immediate, the grip of someone who'd been waiting to grab anything solid. He pulled. The mud held. He pulled harder, bracing his bare foot against something buried a root. A rock and the mud made a sound like a mouth closing tighter. Up on the road, a wagon had stopped, a merchant in a brown coat, a cattleman beside him, chewing tobacco. They sat on the bench and watched. The merchant leaned toward the cattleman and said something Caleb couldn't hear. The cattleman spat over the wheel. Neither one moved. The mud crept an inch higher on her ribs and strapped to her hip, half buried. She held a leather pouch against her body with her free arm, held it tighter than she held him. He fought his way back to the bank. Each step cost him. The mud grabbed his bare feet and held, releasing with a wet, sucking sound that vibrated up through his shins. By the time he reached solid ground, his legs were shaking and his breath came in ragged pulls. Boone stood where he'd left him, ears flat, nostrils wide at the smell of the mud. Caleb untied the rope from the saddle pack, looped it over his shoulder, and waded back in. She hadn't sunk further. She'd spread her free arm across the surface, palm down, fingers wide distributing her weight. Smart. The kind of smart that comes from knowing what mud does. He worked the rope under her arms and cinched it against the leather pouch she would not release. His fingers brushed the pouch, and she flinched not from pain, from possession. Whatever was inside mattered more than the mud. Back on the bank, rope around Boone's saddle horn, 2 wraps, tight. "Pull," he said, and slapped the mule's haunch. Boone leaned forward. The rope sang. A thick, wet sound, the ground releasing what it had taken, and she slid across the surface and onto the grass. Face down, coughing mud. Caleb dropped beside her. His arms wouldn't stop shaking. Rain ran into his eyes and he couldn't blink it clear. His feet were torn. He could feel where the rocks had cut through his socks on the crossings. And the cold had turned the pain into something distant. Like a sound heard through a wall, the woman rolled onto her back. Mud covered her from the chest down, drying in cracked lines across her calico skirt and leggings. Her hands went to the leather pouch first. She opened it, looked inside, pressed it closed. Then she looked at him. "My horse." The English came out slow, each word placed like a stone set into mortar. "That way." The spotted mare hadn't gone far. She stood in the tree line, shivering, her reins tangled in catclaw brush. Caleb freed her and brought her back. The woman took the reins without meeting his eyes, ran her palm down the mare's nose, and said something in a language he didn't know. The horse stopped trembling. Up on the road, the wagon was moving. The merchant didn't look back. The cattleman did one long glance over his shoulder, the kind that memorizes faces. His cabin was a 20-minute walk through the pines. He started toward it, leading Boone, and the woman followed on the mare. Neither spoke. Inside, the stove still held warmth from the morning's fire. He fed it 2 splits of pine and set the coffee pot on, got the cornbread from the shelf, half around. 2 days old, still decent. She sat on the floor near the stove, not on the chair. She'd untied the pouch and spread its contents across the plank boards with a precision that made his hands feel thick and clumsy. Small bundles, each wrapped in cloth and tied with a different color thread. Red, yellow, a pale blue that looked like it came from berries. She pressed each one between her fingers, held one to her nose, arranged out them in a line along the warm floor to dry. The way she touched them, checking weight, testing moisture, adjusting ties reminded him of old Dr. Marsh handling his instruments. Practiced, certain. He set the cornbread and a tin cup of coffee on the floor beside her. She picked up the cup, drank. Her eyes moved over the cabin, one chair, bare window, shelf with nothing on it. Her gaze stopped on the nail by the door, the bone-handled knife. She looked at it for a long time. He didn't explain. "My brother," she said. "Coda, 16. Left home 3 months." She tore a piece of cornbread. "Clifton, copper mine. He heard good money." She chewed, swallowed. "He heard wrong. You're looking for him alone." She didn't answer. She reached for the coffee pot, poured a second cup, and drank it with both hands wrapped around the tin. her face close enough for the steam to touch her skin. He noticed her lips moving when her eyes passed the liniment bottle on the shelf, reading, sounding out the label under her breath. "You read English," he said. "Presbyterian school. Tucson. 2 years." She set the cup down and went back to her bundles. She finished, retied the pouch, stood. "I go now, before dark." He walked her to the porch. The spotted mare stood hip-shot at the rail, dozing. The rain had eased. The sky to the west was cracking open copper light, spilling through the clouds and turning the wet road into a low amber glow. She mounted, looked down at him once, turned the horse and rode south without looking back. Caleb stood on the porch. The boards were damp under his cracked spare boots. Boone came around from the side of the cabin and pushed his nose into his palm. He rubbed its jaw and watched the empty road until the light went flat. On the table inside, next to his cup, she'd left a small bundle of dried sage wrapped in cotton cloth. The smell hit him when he picked it up sharp, warm. Nothing like pine or wood smoke. Something foreign in a room that held nothing foreign. Agnes Whitfield's wagon rattled up the road before full dark. She came for the lumber count. She always had a reason. But she stood on his porch longer than lumber required, her eyes on the sage he'd set on the shelf. "What's that?" She left it. Agnes picked it up, held it under her nose. "Sage. Apache burn it to cleanse a place." She looked at him sideways. "Or to say thank you. Depends how you read it." She climbed onto her wagon. "Pruitt wants that lumber Thursday." "Saturday." Agnes laughed short. "Dry. Just like my Edwin, stubborn and quiet. Kept me guessing 32 years. She flicked the reins. "That's not the worst combination." The wagon disappeared down the red road. Caleb went inside. He washed both tin cups and set them on the shelf, side by side. 2 cups where there had been 1. In the morning, he found it on the porch rail, a small purple wildflower, pressed flat, as if someone had held it between thumb and palm for a long time before setting it down. Wind doesn't press flowers flat. He brought it inside and placed it on the shelf between the sage and the liniment bottle. 3 things on a shelf that used to hold 1. And across the valley, somewhere past Sycamore Creek, a woman with a leather pouch rode a spotted horse toward a copper mine where a 16-year-old boy had gone looking for money and found something else entirely. 3 weeks later, the rain still hadn't stopped. Not the hard, honest rain from the day at the mudflats. This was different, a gray drizzle that hung over Elkhorn Crossing like wet wool, turning every road into a creek and every ditch into a pond. Water stood in places it had never stood before, behind the livery stable, along the church foundation, in the shallow ruts between the houses on Main Street, where mosquitoes bred in clouds thick enough to feel on exposed skin before a man could see them. Caleb brought the last load of timber into Pruitt's sawmill yard on a Tuesday morning and found the place half empty. The saw sat idle, its blade still wet from yesterday's cut. Pruitt's foreman, a bow-legged man named Hicks, was stacking planks alone. "Where's everybody?" Hicks wiped his forehead with a rag that was dirtier than his skin. "Dawson's home. Both his kids have the fever. Baker's girls, too, both of them. And the Thompson widow's youngest. The little redhead." He spat into the mud. 5 kids in 2 weeks. Some of the adults caught it mild a day of aches. Gone by morning. But in the children it grabs hold and won't let go. He shook his head. Doc Marsh has been running house to house like a man trying to plug a leaking boat with his fingers. Caleb unloaded the timber, stacked it, counted the board feet, signed the receipt with the pencil stub, Hicks kept tied to a plank with twine. Normal work, normal motions, but the yard felt wrong, too quiet, too still. The way a forest goes silent before a storm, even when the wind hasn't shifted. He walked to Dr. Marsh's office on the far end of the street. The building was narrow clapboard, painted white once, now weathered to the color of old bone. The shingle above the door read L. Marsh. M.D. in letters that had faded past reading in certain light. He knocked. Nothing. He pushed the door open. Marsh sat behind his desk, not reading, not writing, sitting. The glass-fronted medicine cabinet behind him held rows of brown and green bottles, neatly labeled. A kerosene lamp burned on the desk, though it was midday. And in its yellow light, the doctor's face looked like something carved from tallow. Cheeks hollow, beard 3 days past trimming, growing in uneven patches of gray and white. His hands rested on the desk, palms down, fingers curled slightly inward, the hands of a man who had run out of things to reach for. Caleb. Marsh's eyes took a moment to find focus. Don't sit. There's nothing to sit about. Hicks told me. Dawson kids. Baker girls. 6 now. Marsh stood and walked to the cabinet, opened it, stared at the bottles without touching them. Tommy Pruitt started this morning. Fever. Red rash across the chest, same as the others. Maggie sent for me at dawn. He closed the cabinet. The glass rattled in its frame. 6 children. Caleb. 6 in 2 weeks. The adults shake it in a day. But the children burn. What is it? I don't know. He said it the way a carpenter says a board is warped flat. Factual. Stripped of everything but the measurement. The standing water. The mosquitoes. Something breeding in every puddle between here and the river. I don't know which, and I don't know what. He pointed at a small bookcase in the corner, maybe 20 volumes, spines cracked and leaning. I've read every page on that shelf. Nothing matches. The rash is wrong for scarlet fever, wrong for typhoid, wrong for malaria. Though the mosquitoes would make you think so. He sat down. The chair complained under him, though there wasn't much to complain about anymore. The Thompson girl is the worst, Ella's youngest. She seized last night, twice. He leaned forward, and the lamplight caught the veins in his temples. If the fever doesn't break in the next few days, that child won't make it. She weighs 40 pounds, and she's burning through what's left of her faster than her body can rebuild. Caleb looked at the cabinet, at the rows of bottles with their careful labels, at the books with their cracked spines, at the lamp burning in the middle of a day too dark for its own windows. I'll come by tomorrow, he said. Marsh nodded. His eyes had already drifted back to the cabinet. Outside, the drizzle had thickened. Caleb pulled his hat low and led Rust along Main Street toward the South Road. The town had gone hollow, fewer people on the boardwalks, fewer horses at the rails. A woman he didn't know stood in a doorway holding a child wrapped in a blanket. The child's face flushed and damp against her shoulder. She rocked side to side, and the motion had the look of something her body was doing without her permission. He passed the church. The door stood open, and inside 3 women knelt in the front pew with their heads bowed. The candles on the altar threw long, unsteady shadows across the empty benches. He passed the general store. Agnes was sweeping the porch with short, aimless strokes that moved the same dust back and forth without getting anywhere. She looked up when he passed, didn't speak, just looked. He passed the Pruitt house. It was the largest in Elkhorn Crossing, 2 stories. Glass in every window, white paint, green shutters, a porch with turned posts that Harold Pruitt had milled himself the year he opened the sawmill. It sat on the corner of Main and the South Road like a man standing at the head of a table. The downstairs window on the east side was open despite the rain. The kerosene lamp inside pulled his eye the way fire pulls it in darkness. He could see Maggie's shape sitting in a straight-backed chair beside a small iron bed, leaning forward, her hand moving in a steady rhythm, pressing a cloth to the bed, lifting, pressing again, behind her. The dim glow caught the edge of a child's quilt bunched at the foot, and the outline of a small body beneath it, motionless. He couldn't see the boy's face from the street. He didn't need to. Caleb stopped. His hand tightened on Rust's reins. The leather cut into his palm. He stood in the rain and watched Maggie press that cloth and lift it. Press and lift. And something turned behind his ribs, not a thought. Not yet. A physical thing. The way a key turns in a lock before the door moves. He smelled sage. Not real sage. There was no sage burning in Elkhorn Crossing, but the smell was there, sharp and warm, rising from somewhere behind his sternum. The bundle on his shelf, the small hands on his cabin floor, sorting colored threads, the careful way she placed each English word like a stone in mortar. Presbyterian school, Tucson, 2 years. The way she'd held the pouch tighter than the branch that was supposed to save her life. She knew plants the way Marsh knew bottles, maybe better. Caleb turned Rust south and walked, not running, but not the pace of a man heading home to sit in his one chair. The nearest army surgeon was at Fort Grant, 4 days' ride in good weather, 5 in this mud. Clifton's doctor had packed up and left 2 months ago. Globe was farther than Grant by the mountain road. Marsh had already written to Tucson and Phoenix, but the mail moved slower than the fever. There was one person within 100 miles who might know what was burning through the children of Elkhorn Crossing, and she had ridden southeast 3 weeks ago, toward the Pinaleno foothills, looking for a boy who'd gone to a copper mine and heard wrong. He needed to talk to Agnes. He needed to talk to Marsh, and he needed to do both before morning, because the Thompson girl had seized twice last night, and 4 days was a number that child did not have. He'd gone to Agnes before dawn. The store was still dark when he knocked. She opened the door in a wool shawl and house slippers, her white hair loose around her shoulders, and she listened without interrupting, which was not her way. And that told him more than anything she could have said. "Southeast," Agnes said. She stood at the counter with a cup of coffee she hadn't offered him, both hands around it, her eyes sharp in the lamplight. Toward the Pinalenos, Lem Hooper saw cook fires smoke up near Sycamore Creek not 2 weeks back. Small camp. If she's looking for a brother who went to Clifton, she'd pass through that corridor. She sipped, set the cup down. A day's hard ride if the creek crossings hold. Now the church smelled like damp wool and kerosene. 13 people sat or stood in the narrow space between the pine pews. Mrs. Dawson twisted a handkerchief around her index finger until the tip went white. Unwound it. Wound it again. Baker stood against the back wall with his arms crossed, his jaw working on nothing. Ella Thompson sat in the front pew alone, her hands flat on her knees, her eyes on the altar candles without blinking. Harold Pruitt stood behind the pulpit. He gripped the edges with both hands, and the wood flexed under his fingers. His hair had gone white at the temples. Caleb hadn't noticed that before. Or it hadn't been there before. His face was the color of old tallow. His eyes were red-rimmed and swollen half shut. "I've sent word to Fort Grant," Pruitt said. His voice was steady, the voice of a man who had practiced being steady until the practice became the only thing holding the steadiness together. Army surgeon. Best available. 4 days' ride there and back if the weather holds. His knuckles whitened on the pulpit edge. Could be 5. The silence that followed had weight. Baker shifted against the wall. The floorboards groaned. From the back pew, Agnes Whitfield's voice cut through the room like a wire through cheese. 4 days. Harold. Pruitt looked at her. I know the number. Agnes. You know numbers. Agnes sat with her back straight, her hands folded over the handle of the cane she'd started carrying that spring. Though everyone in Elkhorn Crossing knew she didn't need it for walking. She needed it for pointing. She pointed it now at Ella Thompson's back. Ella's girl seized twice last night. That child weighs 40 pounds, and she's soaking through sheets faster than her mother can wring them. 4 days. She lowered the cane to the floor with a tap. You have 4 days. Harold, because that little girl does not. A muscle moved beneath Pruitt's left eye. His jaw locked and released. I'm aware of the situation, Agnes. That's exactly why I called. You're not informing. You're stalling. There's a difference. At my age, I can smell it. The room shifted. Baker uncrossed his arms. Mrs. Dawson stopped winding the handkerchief. Caleb stood up. Every face turned. He felt them land 12 sets of eyes. 13 with Pruitt's. The newcomer. The lumberjack from the South Road. 8 months in Elkhorn Crossing, and he could count his friends on one hand with fingers left over. He knew the Mudflat story had traveled. Stories moved through this town faster than the mail. His mouth went dry. His hands hung at his sides, and he didn't know where to put them. 3 weeks back, he said. His voice came out lower than he meant, rougher, like it had to climb over something caught in his throat. I pulled a woman out of the mud down at the river. Apache woman. He swallowed. The words weren't lining up the way he needed them to. She works with plants, medicines, herbs. She had a whole kit with her. Bundles, color-coded. I watched her sort them. Same way Doc Marsh sorts his instruments. He stopped. Started again. Same kind of hands. Pruitt stared at him. She's Apache, Pruitt said. Not a question. Yes, sir. And you want to bring an Apache woman into this town to treat our children with weeds. Caleb's jaw worked. He could feel the room leaning away from him, not in their bodies, but in that invisible way people lean when they've already chosen a side. I'm saying she might help. That's all I've got. Mr. Pruitt. Pruitt released the pulpit, stood to his full height, a full head taller than Caleb, and he used every inch. I've made my decision. We wait for the Army surgeon. This meeting is about coordinating care, water schedules, ice from the Miller Ice House, rotating shifts for the mothers. He looked around the room. That's what we're here to discuss. Baker spoke. Harold, just the name, nothing after it, but the weight of it slow, heavy, deliberate made Pruitt's shoulders stiffen. The decision is made, Pruitt said. He stepped down from the pulpit. People filed out. No one spoke to Caleb. Mrs. Dawson passed close enough for her sleeve to brush his arm, and she didn't look at him. Baker passed and looked a long, measuring look, the kind a man gives when he's deciding whether someone is foolish or just early, then looked away. Caleb was the last one inside except for the candles. He stepped off the porch into the gray morning and crossed the street to the rail where Rust stood with his head low, rain beating on his neck. Caleb. Dr. Marsh stood in the narrow gap between the church and the livery stable, half in shadow. His coat was buttoned wrong, one side higher than the other. His right hand was in his vest pocket, turning something. Caleb could hear the faint click of a watch case opening and closing. He led Rust across and stepped into the gap, out of sight from the street. Marsh didn't speak for 10 seconds. Caleb waited. He'd learned that about certain old men, the ones worth hearing, needed silence the way a stove needs air. "I don't know if she can do anything," Marsh said. His voice was low, not whispering. The volume of a man talking to the ground. "I don't know what she's treated. I don't know if anything in that pouch makes a difference against this. I know. I've been doctoring 30 years. I've read everything I own. I've written to Tucson and Phoenix, but the mail won't get there inside a week. And by then..." His hand came out of the pocket. In it was a piece of paper, folded in quarters, covered in small, precise handwriting. Dark iron gall ink, the kind that bit into the page and stayed. Symptoms, every detail I've recorded. Temperature patterns, rash progression, timing of the seizures. He held it out. The bones in his hand showed through the skin, the knuckles swollen, the grip unsteady. If she can read, she can. Marsh looked at him. The lamplight from the church window caught the side of his face, and Caleb saw something there he hadn't seen before, not defeat. But the thing that comes after a man has fought defeat and lost, and is now standing in the space beyond it. "Then give this to her." He pressed the paper into Caleb's palm. The paper was warm from the old man's pocket. "And Caleb..." The watch clicked once more inside the vest and stopped. "Don't tell Harold. Not yet. Not until there's something to tell." He turned and walked toward his office. One side of his coat still rode higher than the other. His shoulders were rounded inward, curved, as if the man inside was trying to take up less room than he used to. Caleb unfolded the paper. Marsh's handwriting was small and exact dates, temperatures, rash patterns drawn in the margins, dosages listed and crossed out and relisted, a careful record of a man's own limits, documented with the precision of someone who believed that if he wrote enough down, the answer would show itself. He folded it and put it in his shirt pocket. Against his chest, Sycamore Creek, southeast. Agnes said a day's hard ride. He swung onto Rust. The south road stretched ahead empty, wet, the ruts filled with brown water. The clouds were cracking in the east, just enough to let a thin line of gold through before closing again. He touched his shirt pocket. The paper crinkled against his heartbeat. Somewhere past that gold line, in the foothills where the ponderosas grew thick and the streams still ran clean, a woman with a leather pouch was either still looking for her brother or had already found him. He followed the Gila southeast through the last of the night and into morning. The rain quit before dawn, not gradually, but all at once, as if someone had closed a valve. The silence it left behind was louder than the rain had been. Rust's hooves on wet rock, the creak of saddle leather, the river running high and amber beside the trail, carrying branches and silt, and the smell of everything it had swallowed upstream. Agnes's direction held. Past the fork at Sycamore Creek, the terrain changed. Cottonwoods thinned and gave way to mesquite and catclaw. The ground rose toward the Pinaleno foothills, and the soil turned from river mud to rocky red clay. In clay, tracks lasted. He found horse droppings at a stream crossing old, mostly dissolved by rain, but the shape suggested an unshod horse. Could be anyone's, could be hers. Rust was flagging by mid-morning. Caleb let him drink at every creek and held him to a walk on the grades. The air had turned sharp and clean, the kind that comes when the ground is still soaked, but the sky has decided to quit. Juniper and wet stone, and underneath it all the mineral taste of water running over granite. He climbed into a shallow canyon, pinon and juniper on the ridgeline. A red-tailed hawk circled above the rim, riding thermals that rose from warming rock. He watched it without stopping, the kind of thing a man notices when he's been alone long enough that his mind reaches for anything that moves. By early afternoon, he found the campsite, tucked into an alcove at the base of a sandstone bluff, invisible from the main trail unless a man came at it from the stream side, a fire ring built from river stones carefully made, ashes cold, not scattered. Rabbit bones cracked for marrow, stacked beside the ring. 2 sets of moccasin prints in the damp sand, one larger, one smaller, at the stream's edge, where the water pooled behind a natural dam of stones. A shallow pit had been dug and lined with flat rocks, a soaking pit, for roots, 2 sets of prints. She'd found her brother. He followed the tracks upstream, fresher here, edges sharp. Toe prints deep where someone had pushed off climbing a grade. The stream narrowed to a trickle between mossy rocks, and the canyon opened into a small meadow ringed with ponderosa pine, knee-high grass, heavy with dew that the morning sun hadn't burned off. She sat at the far edge, beside the stream, her back to him. Her hands were in the water. She was washing roots, long, pale, fibrous, with dark bark peeling away in strips, each one held in the current, turned, inspected, set on a flat stone to dry. The leather pouch sat open beside her on a square of cloth, its contents arranged in the order he remembered from his cabin floor. Red thread, yellow thread, pale blue. 10 feet behind her, a boy sat cross-legged on a fallen log. 16, thin, the kind of thin that comes from bad food and too much work. Not from choice. His face was sun-darkened unevenly, the way a man's face gets when he's spent months outdoors without a hat. His cheekbones stood out sharp beneath the skin. He wore canvas trousers, miner's trousers, the kind company stores sold for $1.50 and worth about half, and a cotton shirt with the sleeves torn off at the elbows. But on his feet, moccasins, deerskin, the stitching tight and even. She'd brought them, or made them. The boy had a short bow across his knees. No arrow knocked. His hands rested on the limbs, the way a man's hands rest on a tool he knows without looking. His eyes were on Caleb before Caleb cleared the tree line. Tala didn't turn. "Your horse is loud," she said. Caleb dismounted, led Rust to the stream. The boy Coda watched every step, eyes moving from Caleb's face to his hands to the empty holster loop on his belt where no gun hung. The calculation was quick and practiced. Coda's grip on the bow loosened. His shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch. Caleb reached into his shirt pocket and took out the folded paper. He walked to where Tala sat and held it out. She dried her hands on her skirt, took it, unfolded it. She read slowly. Her lips moved over the English words, not struggling, but careful, the way a person reads a language learned in a classroom and used in the field. Her index finger traced the lines of Marsh's handwriting, pausing at the medical terms. Moving past the dosages, she turned the paper over. Marsh had drawn the rash pattern on the back, small circles clustered across a child's chest and neck, annotated in his tight hand. Her hands went still. She looked at the drawing, then at the roots drying on the stone beside her, then at the leather pouch. She said something to Coda in Apache. Short. The boy's head came up. He looked at Caleb, then at his sister, asked a question quick, rising. She answered in one sentence. Coda's jaw set, but he nodded. He laid the bow on the log and stood. "How many children?" Tala said. 6. The youngest is 5 or 6, the Thompson girl. She's been seizing. The oldest is 11. Tala folded the paper along its original creases and placed it into the pocket of her doeskin shirt. She began packing the roots, quickly now, each one wrapped in cloth, tied, placed into the pouch with the same precision he remembered. Red thread, yellow, pale blue. Her hands moved faster than they had before the shift a carpenter makes when he sets the sandpaper down and picks up the saw. Standing water, she said without looking up. Mosquitoes, yes. 3 weeks of rain, puddles everywhere, ditches, behind every building, along every foundation. My grandmother called this. She paused. Her mouth shaped a word that had no English to land on. Red fever. From the water. Not the drinking, the standing. The still water breeds it. Children have no strength against it. Bodies too small. She cinched the pouch and stood. The movement was fluid, unhurried, but complete the motion of someone who has made a decision and left no part of herself behind in the making. I have osha, yarrow, willow bark. She counted with her eyes on the pouch, fingers pressing each bundle through the leather. Enough for 6. If they are small, they're small. Then enough. She untied the spotted mare from the piñon where she'd been grazing. The horse stepped toward her, ears forward. Tala checked the cinch, tightened it, and swung the pouch over the saddle horn. Coda had already broken camp, bedroll, canvas sack. Water skin gathered and packed with the efficiency of someone who'd done it many times and fast. The miner's trousers hung loose on his hips, belted with rawhide. He mounted a scrubby bay gelding that looked like it had been borrowed from a miner's string and never returned. Tala looked at Caleb from the saddle. The sun had passed its peak and was dropping west. Shadows of ponderosas stretched across the meadow in long, dark bars. I need clean water, she said. A fire, a pot clay or iron, not tin. Tin changes the medicine. She gathered the reins. And they must not stand behind me when I work. How long back to town? You rode from there. You tell me. Hard ride. We can make it by late tonight if we don't stop. Then don't stop. They rode 3 abreast down the canyon, Caleb on Rust. Tala on the spotted mare, Coda on the bay. The boy rode straight-backed, the bow slung across his shoulder. His eyes swept the ridgeline on both sides, not fear but habit. The habit of people who had learned that the land was always watching. The trail dropped through mesquite back to the Gila. The river ran high but lighter muddy amber instead of brown. They crossed at a shallow riffle, horses stepping between rocks, water around their hocks. Tala pulled up without warning on the far bank, swung down, walked 3 steps into the ditch beside the road, and knelt. When she stood, she held a cluster of small yellow flowers on a thin green stem. She crushed one between her fingers, held it to her nose, and tucked the rest into her pouch. She remounted without explanation. Coda glanced at Caleb. It was the first time the boy had looked at him without measuring him for threat. Not warmth, not trust, something smaller, the recognition of a boy who understood his sister had made a decision, and this man on the brown horse was part of it. The sun dropped behind the Pinalenos. The sky went copper, then rust, then a bruised purple along the western ridge. The road became a dark red line between the mesquite. Caleb's thighs burned from the saddle. Rust's head hung low. Running on will more than energy. They'd been moving since before dawn, almost 14 hours. Nothing but stream water and a handful of jerky he'd forgotten was in his saddlebag. Tala had not asked about the town. She had not asked whether they wanted her there, whether Pruitt would let her through the door. Whether the people who had watched her sink in the mud 3 weeks ago would welcome her into their houses. She had read the paper. She had counted the children. She had packed her pouch and said, "Don't stop." Night came down full. The road turned to shadow. The horses picked their footing by instinct, stumbling on roots, slipping on wet rock. Nobody spoke. Coda slumped forward over the bay's neck, jerked awake, slumped again. Tala rode straight-backed, one hand on the reins, the other on the pouch at her hip. Her eyes fixed on the road ahead, even when the road was nothing but black. And somewhere at the end of that road, behind a closed oak door, Harold Pruitt sat in the dark beside his son's bed, a man who had gripped a pulpit with white knuckles and said the decision is made. They came into Elkhorn Crossing in the last hour before dawn, and the horses were barely walking. Rust's head hung so low the reins dragged against the road. Caleb's thighs had gone from burning to numb somewhere around midnight, and the numbness had spread upward into his hips and lower back, until the whole lower half of his body felt like it belonged to someone else. The ride back had been a negotiation with darkness horses, picking footing by instinct on a trail they couldn't see, stumbling on roots, slipping on wet rock. Nobody had spoken for hours. Coda had slept in the saddle and jerked awake and slept again, his body folding over the bay's neck like a cloth draped on a rail. Tala hadn't slept. She'd ridden straight-backed the entire way, one hand on the reins, the other on the pouch. Her eyes on the road ahead, even when the road was nothing but black. The town was quiet in the way sick places are quiet. Not peaceful, held. No one on the boardwalks, no horses at the rail. Smoke rose from chimneys in thin gray threads, and the smoke itself looked reluctant, as if the fires inside were burning low and nobody had the will to feed them. Agnes stood on the porch of the general store, broom in one hand, the other on the doorframe. She watched them come up the street, and she didn't speak. She looked at Tala, at the pouch, at Coda, and the bow across his shoulder. Then she looked at Caleb, and her chin dipped a quarter inch. She turned, went inside, and Caleb heard the kettle hit iron. Water being pumped. The store was being opened for something that had nothing to do with selling. They rode to the Pruitt house. Harold Pruitt stood on the porch. He was wearing the same shirt from the church meeting, the same one. Caleb was certain. Because the collar was dark with dried sweat, and the left cuff had a stain that hadn't been there 4 days ago. His hair stuck out on one side in a way that would have been foolish on any other man. He hadn't shaved. The stubble came in patches gray on the jaw, white on the neck, uneven, as if even his beard had lost its pattern. His eyes were swollen nearly shut. His hands hung at his sides, the fingers opening and closing against his thighs in a rhythm that matched nothing. He smelled like the sick room. Caleb caught it from the street-stale sweat. Urine. The sour mineral smell that comes off a body burning past the point where wet cloths and broth make a difference. 4 days of it soaked into his clothes. His skin, his hair, the smell of a man who had stopped noticing what clung to him because the thing creating the smell was his son. "She's here," Caleb said. He didn't dismount. Pruitt looked past him at Tala. His eyes traveled from her face to the pouch, to the horse and back. His mouth opened, closed, opened. "I told you. Caleb, I heard you. But Maggie hasn't had her say." Something moved behind Pruitt's eyes fast, involuntary. The twitch of a man who has been hit in a place he didn't know was exposed. His jaw locked. He stepped to the edge of the porch. His boot caught the top step, and his hand shot out for the post. The grip went white. His whole arm shook, not from effort, from something structural giving way underneath. He stood there gripping the post, and Caleb saw it. The thing below the authority, and the white paint, and the glass in every window. Pruitt's lower lip was trembling, not anger. His face was trying to do something it had never been asked to do, and the muscles were fighting each other. His chin pulled down, his eyes squeezed shut. When they opened, they were wet, and the wetness made him grip the post harder, as if that post were the last piece of the man he'd been a week ago, and releasing it would finish what the fever had started. "That's my boy in there," Pruitt said. His voice broke on the word, boy. He tried to cover it with a cough. The cough became something else, a sound from his chest, not his throat. The sound of a body that had started grieving before the mind gave permission. "I know," Caleb said. "You don't know what—" The front door opened. The hinges made a sound long, low, metal dragging against metal, the sound a door makes when it hasn't moved in days. Maggie Pruitt stood in the doorway, white cotton nightdress, wrinkled, stained at the hem with broth or medicine or both. Her hair hung past her shoulders in tangles she hadn't touched. Her face was swollen. The skin beneath her eyes bruised the color of ripe plums. She looked like she'd aged a decade in 4 days. In her left hand she held a worn leather Bible, her thumb keeping a page. The spine cracked soft from use. She looked at Tala. Tala sat the spotted mare without moving, the pouch against her hip, hands on the reins. She didn't smile, didn't nod. She waited the way a doctor waits outside a door that isn't hers to open. Present, not pushing. Maggie's eyes went to the pouch. She stared at it. Her free hand, the one not holding the Bible, came up and pressed against the doorframe. Her knuckles whitened. She stepped sideways, 1 step, out of the doorway. Her nightdress brushed the wood. "Harold?" Her voice was a ruin, scraped to nothing. "He's burning up." 3 words. She put her hand over her mouth and held it there, pressing something back. A sound, a sentence. Whatever came after those 3 words, that would have been worse. She stood with her palm clamped over her lips and her eyes on her husband, and the Bible hung at her side with her thumb still in the page. And she did not move. Pruitt turned to face her. His hand was still on the post. It slid down an inch, then another. His shoulders dropped. Not a slump, a collapse, slow and total. The kind that happens when a man stops holding up something he cannot hold. His chest caved. His chin hit his sternum. He stood at the top of his own porch steps, in front of his own house built with his own lumber, and everything that had kept him upright, the office, the pulpit, the voice that said, "The decision is made," all of it pulled out from under him at once. He let go of the post. He stepped to the side. He didn't look at Caleb, didn't look at Tala. He looked at the floorboards, the nails he'd driven, the wood he'd milled, the porch he kept painted. He looked at them the way a man looks at something he built when he realizes it was never strong enough for what it needed to hold. His knees didn't buckle, but his hand found the wall, and he leaned into it, and then he slid slowly, his back scraping down the white paint, his shirt catching on a nail head and pulling free until he was sitting on the porch floor with his legs bent and his arms on his knees and his face in his hands. Harold Pruitt. On the floor of his own porch, in a dirty shirt. While a stranger walked through his door, Tala dismounted, handed the mare's reins to Coda without looking, and walked up the steps. Her moccasins made no sound on the wood. As she passed Maggie, the woman's free hand came up the one that had been pressing the doorframe. Her fingers brushed the doeskin sleeve, just brushed it, then fell. Tala stepped through the doorway. The smell hit her 2 steps inside. Sweat, urine, the stale mineral scent of a body that had been burning past the point of recovery by ordinary means, kerosene from a lamp that had been going for days, windows shut against the rain and never reopened. Tommy's room was the first on the right. A child's room, cast-iron bed, wooden chair, a shelf with 3 carved animals and a picture book. The quilt had been kicked to the floor and dragged back and kicked down again, twisted into a rope of damp fabric. Tommy lay in the center of the mattress, arms at his sides, palms up. His nightshirt was soaked through and bunched around his chest. The rash covered him from collarbones to navel-dense red spots. Clustered, merging at the edges, on the bedside table, next to a basin of gray water and a folded cloth. A small Bible sat open, its corner turned at Psalms. She placed her hand on his forehead. The heat came through her palm the way a stovetop comes through a cloth. Not surface warmth, but deep, structural. The kind that means the fire is in the walls. His breathing was wrong. 3 quick pulls, a pause, 2 more, a longer pause, the rhythm of a machine losing its timing. Dr. Marsh sat in the corner. He'd been there all night. The chair had molded to the shape of his body. He held a stethoscope in both hands, the earpieces against his chest, the bell resting in his lap. He looked at Tala. He stood. The chair scraped the floor. He took 1 step backward, then another. His back found the wall. He lifted the stethoscope and set it on the shelf beside the carved animals. He placed it there the way a man sets down a tool he has carried for 30 years and no longer knows what to do with. Then he flattened himself against the wall and made room. Tala opened the leather pouch. She worked with her back to the room. The clay pot Maggie brought was a cooking crock, heavy, dark brown, chipped at the rim. Tala set it on the cast-iron stove in the kitchen and filled it halfway with rainwater from the barrel outside the back door. She waited for the water to warm, her hands moving over the contents she'd laid across a cloth on the kitchen table. 3 bundles, unwrapped. The roots were pale and fibrous, the length of a finger, dark bark peeling away in strips, OSHA. She'd washed them in the stream yesterday morning. Caleb realized, because a full day had passed since the meadow and neither of them had slept. She took a stone from the pouch, small, round, worn smooth to fit the heel of her hand. She set the OSHA roots on the table, placed the stone on top, and pressed down. Rolling, the roots cracked and separated into stringy fibers. The smell rose immediately, sharp, pungent, like camphor mixed with celery seed and something underneath that had no name in any language Caleb knew. It filled the kitchen. Maggie, standing in the doorway, turned her head. Tala didn't notice, or didn't care. She scraped the crushed OSHA into the pot, added the yarrow, tearing the dried clusters apart with her fingers, rubbing them between her palms until the leaves crumbled into fine gray-green pieces that floated on the surface, then the willow bark. She tore it into strips the width of a bootlace and dropped them in one at a time. The water steamed. She adjusted the stove damper, cutting the airflow, lowering the heat. The liquid turned from clear to amber to a dark, opaque brown. And the smell thickened until it was a physical presence, bitter, acrid, dense enough to taste on the back of the tongue without drinking it. She stirred with a wooden spoon from her own pouch, short-handled, carved from juniper, the bowl stained dark from years of use. She stirred slowly, lifting the spoon to watch the liquid run off the wood. Not ready. She stirred again. Her hand paused on the handle, a tremor, brief, running through her fingers into her wrist. She'd been awake past 30 hours. She closed her hand tighter and continued. Dr. Marsh appeared in the kitchen doorway behind Maggie, leather notebook in one hand, pencil stub in the other. He watched Tala's hands. The pencil moved, the liquid thickened. She cut a square of muslin from a piece in her pouch, draped it over a tin cup, pressed the fabric down to form a well, lifted the pot from the stove with both hands, heat coming through the cloth she'd wrapped around the handle, and poured the dark medicine through the muslin. It filtered slowly, dripping into the cup, leaving behind a sediment of bark and root fibers caught in the cloth. She squeezed the muslin, wringing the last drops out, set the cup on the table. She reached into the pouch and took out a second spoon, tiny, the size of a child's little finger, carved from the same juniper. She dipped it into the cup, raised it to her own lips, and tasted. Her face showed nothing. She picked up the cup. "Now," she said, and walked past Maggie into Tommy's room. Tommy hadn't moved. The rash was darker than before, the spots emerging at the edges into blotches that looked like something blooming under his skin. His lips were cracked. A thin line of dried saliva ran from the corner of his mouth to his jaw. His breathing held the same broken pattern, 3, quick. A pause. 2, a longer pause. Tala sat on the edge of the bed. She lifted his head with one hand, her fingers cradling the back of his skull, and brought the small spoon to his lips with the other. A thin stream of dark liquid tipped into his mouth. Tommy's lips moved. He coughed. The medicine dribbled down his chin. She wiped it with her thumb and tried again. "Chideten." His throat worked. He swallowed. She waited. Another spoonful. He swallowed. She began to hum, low, below speech, almost below hearing a vibration more than a melody. Steady, rhythmic. The sound a woman makes when she has done this before, and the waiting is the hardest part, and the sound is for herself as much as for the child. Her mother had hummed this way. Her grandmother before that. It was how she kept time when time was the only thing left to measure. Maggie sat in the chair beside the bed. She reached for Tommy's hand and held it. Her thumb moved across his knuckles in small circles. Her lips were moving words not meant for anyone in this room. A whisper she'd been repeating since the fever started, or since Tommy was born, or since before that, when she'd first understood what it meant to carry something inside her body that could be taken away. Dr. Marsh stood in the doorway, notebook open, pencil moving. He recorded the time, the dose, the method, everything his hands could document, while his mind tried to understand what 30 years and a cabinet full of bottles had missed. The hours passed in spoonfuls. Outside, full dark came down. No moon. The clouds had sealed shut after the brief clearing at sunset. Caleb sat on the top step of the porch, his back against the post. His legs stretched down the steps. The wood was damp under him. A cricket started in the grass beside the foundation. Then another. Then the whole night was pulsing. Coda had taken the horses to the side of the house. Caleb could hear a bit clinking, hooves shuffling on packed dirt. The boy worked quietly. He didn't need instruction with animals. The front door opened. Pruitt came out. He'd been inside somewhere in the house, not in Tommy's room, not in the kitchen. Somewhere a man goes when he has given up his own door and has nowhere left to stand. He was still in the dirty shirt, but the way he carried himself had changed lower, looser, as if the strings that held him upright had been cut throughout the day and only a few remained. He carried a glass bottle in his right-hand whiskey, about a third full. He wasn't drinking from it. He was holding it the way a man holds something he picked up without thinking and forgot to set down. He stood at the porch rail, both hands on the wood. The bottle clinked against the rail. He stared at the dark street. A minute, 2. Crickets. 15 years ago, Pruitt said. He wasn't looking at Caleb. He was talking to the dark. His voice flat, stripped. The sound of wood planed past the grain to bare fiber. Maggie and I went to Tucson for supplies. There was a market. An Apache woman selling stones, agates. She had them laid out on a blanket in the dirt. His thumb rubbed the rail. Maggie couldn't stop looking at them. I told her we didn't need rocks. We needed flour and nails. He stopped. Swallowed. She bought one anyway. Paid $25. I told her she'd been cheated. The crickets filled the cells where the next sentence should have been. She still has it. Keeps it in a dish on her dresser. Every morning she picks it up and turns it in her fingers before she puts her hair up. He set the whiskey bottle on the rail, untouched. I never asked her why. Caleb sat with his back against the post and said nothing. There was nothing to say to a man telling himself a story he should have understood 15 years ago. You don't need to trust her, Caleb said. You just need to let her work. Pruitt turned. For the first time he looked at Caleb, not past him, not through him, at him. His face in the dark was plains and hollows. The eyes sunk deep, the skin loose. He held the look for 3 seconds, then he picked up the bottle, set it on the porch floor, still untouched, and went inside. The door closed with a soft click. Not a slam. The click of a man who had stopped fighting something he should have stopped fighting days ago. Coda appeared at some point and sat on the bottom step. Arms around his knees, chin on his forearms. He slept sitting up the way people sleep who have learned to sleep anywhere. The night stretched. Caleb dozed against the post, woke, dozed again. The crickets kept their rhythm. The dark held. The door opened. Caleb's eyes came open. The sky had changed the black thinning to deep blue-gray in the east. The first bird started in the cottonwoods along the road. A single note. Repeated. Dr. Marsh stepped onto the porch. He moved slowly the way a man moves when he's been still too long and his joints have forgotten their work. He lowered himself onto the step beside Caleb. His hands found his knees and rested there, fingers spread. He didn't speak for a long time. When he did, his voice came in pieces. 30 years, he said. 30 years I've been doing this. He pressed his right hand over his left, rubbing the knuckles. Stitched cowboys, set legs, delivered babies in the backs of wagons. He breathed. I sat in that chair all night, watched her work, a stone and a wooden spoon. That's what she had. He looked at his hands in the gray light, the knuckles swollen, the fingers bent at angles that age puts there. And it did what my whole cabinet couldn't. He rubbed his hands together. I don't feel small. Caleb, I thought I would. I just feel like there's more than I knew. And finding that out at 63. He exhaled. It's just late. That's all. The sky spread light, blue-gray eating the black from the east. The bird kept its single note. The fever, Caleb said, coming down. Marsh said it simply, slowly, but coming down. The sweating started about an hour ago, good sweat. The kind that means the body's pushing back instead of just burning through. His breathing leveled out. She's given him 3 doses. He paused. She hasn't eaten since she arrived, hasn't slept. She's still humming. I think the humming is how she counts time the way I count pulse. The door opened a 3rd time. Maggie stood in the frame, one hand on the wood. Her face was still wrecked, swollen, bruised with sleeplessness, but the muscles around her eyes had shifted, loosened. Something in the rigid mask had softened by a single degree. "He moved," she said. "He moved his hand. He squeezed my fingers." Marsh stood, old knees straightening one at a time, and followed her inside. Caleb stayed on the porch. The sky was lighter. He could see outlines, the livery, the store, the church steeple. Coda was awake on the bottom step, watching the same sky. From inside the house, through the open door, Maggie's voice came broken. Yes, but broken open, the way a sealed jar sounds when the lid finally gives. "Tommy, Tommy, sweetheart, Mama's here. Look at me." Then thin, cracked, the voice of a 7-year-old boy who had been somewhere far away and was finding his way back. "Mama, I'm thirsty." By noon the next day, the Dawson children were drinking broth. Tala worked out of Agnes Whitfield's general store, and the store transformed around her without anyone deciding it should. Agnes cleared the long counter, where she usually stacked flour sacks and fabric bolts, and Tala laid her tools across it, the stone mortar, the wooden spoons, the bundles of osha and yarrow and willow bark, the yellow flowers she'd picked from the roadside ditch crushed into a paste she mixed with water and dabbed on the children's rashes to cool the skin. The clay pot from the Pruitt kitchen sat on Agnes's stove, steaming, and the smell filled the room. Bitter medicine and boiling broth and wood smoke, and underneath it all, the sharp, clean bite of dried sage. 3 smells that didn't belong together and made sense anyway. The families came one at a time. Dawson first, the big blacksmith carrying both his children, one in each arm, a girl of 9 and a boy of 11. Their faces were flushed and damp, the rash visible above their nightshirt collars. He set them on the counter's edge without speaking, looked at Tala, and stepped back against the wall. His wife stood beside him, her hand on his elbow, hard enough to whiten her knuckles. Baker brought his 2 girls next, carried them in on a plank laid across his wagon bed. The girls wrapped in quilts, too weak to walk. His wife followed 3 steps behind, holding a jar of honey she'd brought for no reason anyone could name, and she set it on the counter beside Tala's herbs without a word, as if the jar explained itself. Then Ella Thompson. The widow carried her youngest alone, the red-headed girl, the one who'd been seizing. The child's body hung limp, her head lolling against her mother's shoulder. Ella's face was blank, emptied. The face of a woman who had used up everything and was running on whatever came after. She set the girl on the counter, and her arms stayed out for a moment, still holding the shape of her child, before they dropped. Tala examined each one the same way. Hand on the forehead, 2 fingers at the pulse on the neck, a look at the rash, pressing one spot with her thumb, watching the color drain and return. She adjusted the doses, smaller for the Thompson girl, larger for the Dawson boy. Her hands were steady, but Caleb could see the cost. She blinked slower than she had in the meadow. When she reached for the grinding stone, she missed it, her fingers closing on empty air an inch to the left before finding it. She didn't pause. She didn't sit. She ground the osha and stirred the pot and measured each dose with the tiny spoon. And if anyone noticed that she leaned against the counter between children just a second, just enough to shift the weight off her legs, nobody mentioned it. Dr. Marsh sat on a stool in the corner with his notebook open. His pencil moved in steady strokes. He drew the osha root, the shape, the bark, the way it split under the stone. He wrote everything Tala did. When she measured a dose with the small spoon, he leaned forward on the stool. How much for the 7-year-old different from the 10-year-old? Tala held up her little finger. This much. Half. Marsh squinted at the spoon. You don't have a more precise unit. My finger. She looked at him. Precise enough. Agnes, at the stove, stirring broth beside the medicine pot. He's used to bottles with lines on them. Dear, give him time. Marsh looked at Agnes over his spectacles. I've been practicing medicine since before you opened this store. Agnes. And I've been boiling water since before you learned to read a thermometer. Here. She put a wooden spoon in his hand and pointed at the broth. Marsh stared at the spoon. Then he stirred. His pencil went behind his ear. Coda carried wood in from the pile behind the store, splitting the larger pieces with a hatchet he'd found in Agnes's shed. Agnes watched him through the back window. Small pieces, she called. I'm making medicine, not roasting a pig. Coda looked at her. He didn't catch every word, but he caught the tone. He split the next piece. Thinner. Agnes nodded. Better, you're trainable. That puts you ahead of most men I've known. Marsh had spent an hour that morning explaining to Pruitt what Tala had told him, the standing water, the mosquitoes, the breeding sickness. Drain every ditch, Marsh had said, every puddle, every rut, every low spot behind every building. Root it back to the river. That's what's breeding this. Pruitt had listened without speaking, then walked to the sawmill and put every man he had on shovels before noon. The Thompson girl was the last to respond. Her fever held through the first dose and into the second. Ella sat on the floor beside the counter, holding her daughter's hand, making no sound, just sitting. Tala gave the third dose at dusk. By the time Agnes lit the kerosene lamps, the girl's forehead was damp, good sweat. The body fighting back. Ella's legs gave out. She slid down against the counter with the girl still in her arms. And the sound she made was not crying. It was the sound of someone breathing for the first time after being held under too long ragged. Gasping. Raw. Her whole body shaking with the effort of taking in air she'd forgotten she was allowed to have. Dawson stopped at the door on his way out, his children wrapped in blankets on each hip. He looked at Tala. He didn't speak. He touched the brim of his hat, a small dip, the kind of gesture men make when words are too much and silence isn't enough, and walked out. Baker's wife came back an hour later with a clean blanket and a plate of cornbread wrapped in cloth. She set them on the counter and left without knocking. Caleb heard the rest from Agnes when he came into town for supplies 2 days later. She told it her way, sweeping the porch, rearranging the tinned peaches into the window, not looking at him. Pruitt came out early, she said. Walked across the street to my store. Didn't come in. Left something on the step. Caleb waited. 20-pound sack of rice. Good rice. Not the broken stuff, and a bolt of calico the blue pattern. 12 cents a yard. Best I carry. Agnes swept a line of dust off the porch edge. He took it from his own supply at the mill, carried it across the street himself, then walked back. Didn't knock. Didn't speak. She leaned the broom against the rail and looked at him sideways. That's how Harold Pruitt says he was wrong. You won't hear those words come out of his mouth. Not in this life. But 20 pounds of rice is heavier than any sentence I have ever heard. And he carried it with both hands. Tala and Coda left that afternoon. The spotted mare was saddled, the pouch cinched at her hip. Coda was already mounted on the bay, the bow across his shoulder, his face settled in a way it hadn't been in the meadow. He'd eaten 3 meals at Agnes's table and slept a full night on her store floor, and the sharp edges in his cheekbones had softened by a degree. Tala stopped at Caleb's cabin on the way south. He was on the porch, The same boards, the same spot, the same light as the first time she'd ridden away. He had a tin cup of coffee in his hand. Rust stood at the rail, dozing. Boone was somewhere behind the cabin, chewing on whatever he'd found. Tala pulled up the mare and sat looking at him. The sun was behind her late afternoon, dropping toward the Pinalenos, the sky clear for the first time in a month. Her shadow stretched across the red dirt and up the steps. "You found Coda," Caleb said. "You came back here. Now you're going again." "I go." She adjusted the reins. The leather creaked in her hands. "But I know the road back. Every road comes through here eventually." She smiled, the first time he'd seen it. Quick, small, the way sun breaks through moving clouds and is gone before a man is certain it was there. "Not every road. This road." She pointed at the ground, the red dirt track that ran from his cabin south toward the river. The road she'd come in on 5 weeks ago, mud covered and sinking. The road she was riding down again. Coda clucked the bay forward. He passed Caleb without stopping, but he turned his head, a look, not warm, not cold, the look of a boy who had watched his sister trust someone and filed it away for later. He nodded, small, barely there. Then his back was straight and the bow caught the light and he was past. Tala turned the mare. She rode down the red road without looking back. The same as the first time. The hooves left prints in the damp earth, clear, sharp, filling slowly with water that seeped up from below. Caleb watched until the road was empty. Boone came around from behind the cabin and stood beside him, not pushing, just standing hip-cocked, ears loose, the way a mule stands when it has nowhere else to be. He went inside. One room, one chair, one window, the stove cold and ticking, the shelf, the nail by the door with the bone-handled knife. On the shelf, the sage bundle from the first time, the pressed purple wildflower from the morning after, and tucked between them a small packet wrapped in cloth and tied with red thread. He picked it up. 3 pieces of osha root, dried, dark. The smell rose and mixed with the sage and the faint sweetness of the old flower. And the cabin held all 3. He set it back, on the nail by the door. The bone-handled knife hung where it always hung, but wound around the nail, twice around. Knotted once was a piece of thread, red. The dyed thread from Tala's bundles, thin and smooth. He hadn't put it there. He hadn't seen her put it there. He touched it. The knot was tight and small and deliberate. He left it. He went back to the porch, sat in the rocking chair Agnes had given him 2 months ago, the one from her own porch, the one she said was taking up room since Edwin died. The runners creaked against the pine board, a slow sound, back and forth. The coffee was still warm. He drank it. The tin cup rested against his lower lip, and the steam curled past his eyes. And through the steam he could see the red road running south between the mesquite. Empty. Quiet. The ruts drying in the last of the day's sun. A cricket started in the grass beside the steps. Then another. Then the whole yard was singing the high, pulsing trill that comes when the ground has dried and the insects know summer has arrived and the rain is finished. The chair creaked. The coffee cooled. The light went from gold to amber to the color of old honey. Inside, the shelf held 3 things that hadn't been there 2 months ago. The nail held a thread that hadn't been there yesterday. And in the kitchen, 2 tin cups stood side by side, the same 2 he'd washed and placed together the night she first left. The night he'd sat in this chair and looked at them until the lamp burned down. He hadn't moved them since. He wasn't going to. The crickets sang. The chair creaked, the road ran south, and somewhere on it, getting smaller against the last of the light, a spotted horse carried a woman with a leather pouch who knew the way back. There's something that stays after a story like this, something quiet and a little heavy, the way a room feels after someone has been sick in it and then, finally, slept. Many of us have stood where Caleb stood, watching someone ride away down a road we didn't build, carrying something we gave but can't name. Some of us have been Harold Pruitt, sitting on our own porch floor in a dirty shirt, too frightened to say what we needed until a stranger said it for us. And perhaps some of us have been Tala walking into a room where we weren't wanted, doing the work anyway, and leaving before anyone found the right words. We carry these moments, the times we were too proud, or too slow, or too afraid, the people who helped us when we hadn't earned it. We don't need to understand why those memories still feel warm after all these years. They just do. And that's enough. It's all right to let them sit where they are. The way Caleb left those 2 tin cups, standing side by side. Thank you for being here tonight. Thank you for staying until the road was empty and the crickets sang.